have talked about the challenge that the modern period has posed for the Arab and Muslim nations in terms of economic development, social development, and military competition. This is a challenge that has been ongoing for the last 200 years, so it's not a new phenomenon. But the challenge is becoming particularly acute in the wake of the recent upheavals and transformations that have been ongoing, particularly in the Arab world. And one of the elements that is not, in my view, is not sufficiently being paid attention to is the necessity to dramatically improve the economic performance of the societies and their states, and in the wake of the problems faced with the transformation processes. In this book, by a prominent group of economists brought together by the Brookings Institution, the authors tried to focus on the particular challenge posed by the transformation system. So if you look at this graph, they identified a group of 103 countries that in the recent decades have undergone dramatic political transformations. And this group of 103 countries, it can be roughly divided into two groups. One group, which is represented by this top graph, 57 countries, whose economy, represented here by the gross domestic product, has continued to increase after the transformation. So the transformation might have been traumatic, rapid, radical, but the economy continued to grow. And as you can easily imagine, this will create a positive situation for the stabilization of the new political order. However, an almost equally sized group, represented by the lower graph here, 46 countries, they have experienced sometimes dramatic decreases in the gross domestic product after the transformation, something that can again easily be imagined. Once the old political order changes, old certainties fall down, the production might decrease or actually collapse, and with that income collapses, and you can easily imagine that this will have a negative impact on the likelihood of stabilization of the polity. And what the authors in this book are now warning the new governments that came to power after the spring in the Arab countries are now alerting them to is that once your economy goes into decline, the likelihood of the transformation ending peacefully and stably dramatically decreases. So that is the backdrop. Now look at the following graph, which shows value added per worker and divided by region, which is a fairly good approximation of the relative economic performance of different regions. And if you can see here, the two top graphs, they are represented by the so-called Asian tigers, the China, Vietnam, Korea. And they have, in the last 20 plus years, seen a very, very dramatic increase in the productivity per worker. And that obviously then transforms in also in increase in wages, increase in wealth overall. And you can easily see that the overall economy of these countries is doing rather well, as we all know, with respect to China, for example. And now look at, in the middle you have Eastern Europe and Central Asia that have done moderately well enough. You have in the yellow line, the high-income OECD countries, the already established, developed industrial countries, and so they have done, they have increased their GDP about 20% in the last 20 years, which is a decent enough performance. But now look at the two lower. This is an interesting phenomenon. The red line represents sub-Saharan Africa, which has been for many years, right up to the millennium, has been quite stagnant. And then in the last 10, 15 years, you see that they have dramatically increased their productivity. And that transforms to greater GDP. And with a greater GDP, you will have greater likelihood of a stabilization of the political system. And what is now somewhat important for us to see is the green line, which are the Arab countries. And you see that over a period of 20 years, not only have they remained stagnant in terms of the productivity of the worker, it's by far the worst performing region in the world. And if the productivity per worker does not increase, there is less wealth to be shared, so there's less potential for increased wages. But this, keep it in mind, against the expectation of rising living standards that people have. And another graph that shows the relative poverty of the Arab economic performance. In this graph, you see the trade that they do with other countries. So you see here at the bottom, this is inner Arab trade. It's almost insignificant with respect to global trade that you see. So they're not producing very much, and they're not producing very much that the rest of the world wants to buy, and they're not trading very much with themselves. So here you have the ingredients of a problematic economic story. And now look at the demographic development that is happening at the same time. And together, you have the recipe for a problem. If you look at this graph, which shows population growth in percentage over the last 50 years, you have here at the bottom the EU countries, the rich industrial countries in Western Europe, and their population has remained more or less stagnant, and which causes its own problems that are not the problems we have to deal with here. But by and large, their populations are stagnant. You have a population growth between 0 and 1%. And if you look at the rest of the world, it has hovered between 1 and 2%, which is a reasonable population growth that is not causing too many problems. But if you now look at the Arab countries here at the top, they have had very, very large population increases, between roughly around 3% per year. And some of countries in the Arab world have had even higher, and this is the average for all of the Arab world. So some of them have had higher population growth than 3%. And this together transforms, you can easily imagine, into what has been described as a youth bulge. We have a very young population that is now entering the labor market. And so the percentage of young people throughout the Arab and Muslim world is very, very large. In some parts, you have 2/3 of the population below the age of 30. And against this background, look at the following chart now. We have all of the Arab countries throughout the last 30 years have invested very heavily in education, which primarily is a good thing. So you see here average years of schooling for selected Arab countries, but it's the same for the other Arab countries that we don't have in this chart. And you can see that on the left-hand side it says years of schooling, and it started here in the 1970s with between 1 and 3 years of schooling on average for the working age population. And this is in 1970. And if you now look at 2010, we have, for Jordan, now the average is 9 years of schooling. And for Morocco, which is the least well-performing, it's still more than 4 years of schooling for the average population, which is primarily a good thing. But now, keep in mind that the years of schooling correspond to an expectation of the person who went to school and to university that he will now reap the benefits of a university education that historically has accrued to people. And that is where we now see the challenge, because the state that historically has offered in the, what we called, the Arab social contract, the authoritarian bargain, which had offered to its population the promise of stable, secure government jobs if you had a certain type of education. That is the promise that these young people are now trying to claim, and that the state is no longer able to fulfill. So you have now a very large, young, reasonably well-educated population entering the labor market, looking for good, well-paid, stable government jobs that the government no longer can provide. And that is the backdrop of the very considerable unrest and dissatisfaction, particularly in the young population, that you see. And if you look at this graph, it superimposes unemployment rates for different social groups and the overall labor force growth. So labor force growth is represented here by this pink line. And you see that overall here, it is between 2% and 5% annual labor force growth. So there are between 2 and 5% every year new people entering the labor market for whom jobs need to be created. And that is a challenge for any economy, and it's particularly a challenge that here now we have a select group of Arab nations, that they have been very, very unequally able to fulfill for different population groups. And if you look at the light blue columns, which represent youth unemployment, so the people between 15 and 24, you have here for Algeria unemployment rates of 45% in the young groups. It's for Bahrain, it's 20%. For Egypt, it's 30%. For Jordan, it's close to 40%. And this gives you an indication of the social dynamic that is waiting there. Young people, reasonably well educated, with an expectation of stability, people who want to start families, who cannot start families because they can't find jobs. So you have young people who are sexually frustrated, who are economically frustrated, and who are domestically, live in domestically repressive system. That is the backdrop to the Arab Revolution. And you need to keep this in mind, because that's the paradox to the overall relatively positive economic indicators that were seen before. So if you look now at this graph, which shows the results of an opinion poll that was held in 2007 and 2010, and shows the response of people to the question, how well are you doing? How do you ascertain your present economic position and your outlook onto the immediate future? You see dramatically different responses in the span of 3 years. And the responses people give you already an indication for the political stability that we see then in the so-called Arab Spring. So if you look, for example, at a country like Jordan here, people are actually describing themselves as doing better. In 2010, they are more optimistic. More people are describing themselves as thriving. The same here for Lebanon. More people are describing themselves as thriving. We are doing well. My situation right now is good, and my hope for the future is even better. And the same here for the Palestinian territories and the United Arab Emirates. Not incidentally, these are also the countries that have remained relatively stable in the transformation. If you now look at the other countries, if you look at Egypt and Tunisia, for example, people were reasonably happy in 2007, but dramatically fewer people are now describing their economic position as good. They describe themselves as thriving in the span of 3 years. And the same story continues for Bahrain and for Morocco, for Syria, obviously, and to some extent for Saudi Arabia. And this is the backdrop, this is the expectation that motivated people at the beginning of the Arab transformations. So people are unhappy with their economic situation, and that motivates them to do something about it in the political field. And that is the novelty in the Arab rebellion now that people are actually doing something. But the backdrop, and that's what I would like you to remember, is the economic performance of these governments and their societies. Now, if you look at two important countries in the context of the Arab revolt, Egypt and Tunisia, where the revolts respectively started. Here again, we have the responses over a span of 1 year to people's satisfaction with key public services. It's a slightly different group depending on the importance attached in the different countries to the different public services. So if you see here in Egypt, people were asked, how happy are you with public transportation, the environment, i.e. rubbish collection, affordable housing, the educational system. And here again, you see within a span of 1 year, the responses have fallen precipitously, particularly with respect to public transportation, but also with respect to garbage collection, affordable housing, or the educational system. And the same story we can now observe in Tunisia with respect to housing, healthcare, roads, and schools. Obviously, people were particularly unhappy with the way government dealt with the housing problem and healthcare, but still also unhappy with roads and schools. And these were things that motivated many of the revolts in Tunisia and Egypt. So it comes back to the inability of the governments to live up to the traditional Arab social contract of the government providing for its people. Because that was the basis of the social contract. People were relatively docile as long as the government provided. Now the government seems to be unable to provide due to its inability to manage an economy efficiently, and that has motivated the transformations. This is obviously a relatively superficial, relatively cursory glance over a very complex data-driven story. I invite you to look at the book After the Spring that I showed, from which all this data is derived, and at similar reports mentioned, among others, in that book, but elsewhere, to understand the economic background to the political transformations we see. And keep in mind the graph that we showed in the beginning, the potential for destabilization if the new governments that have now come to power are not able to transform not just the constitutional political system and legal system, but also to transform the economies towards a more efficient, less corrupt way of producing enough wealth so that the legitimate expectations of a rising population, growing population, particularly a young population, are met. Because if they're not met, we will see more destabilization and more insecurity.